There are moments in history when silence itself becomes a kind of betrayal, when the faithful who once whispered their doubts in cloistered corridors can no longer remain silent, and the ancient stones of monasteries echo with voices that refuse to bend, voices of rebellion born not from pride, but from sorrow. And now, from the misty hills of Scotland to the marble halls of Rome, a cry is rising again. The monks of the Most Holy Redeemer have spoken, and their words, supported openly by Archbishop Viganò, have shaken the Church to its core. The story unfolding before us is not one of mere disagreement or theological nuance. It is a fracture running through the very heart of the Catholic world, a wound that no council or diplomatic phrase can heal. For decades, tensions have simmered between those who uphold the unchanging truths of the faith and those who seek to reinterpret them in the light of modern sensibilities. But what began as cautious dialogue has now become open confrontation. In the past weeks, Rome has hosted a series of interfaith ceremonies where the successor of Peter stood beside representatives of other religions, Christian and non-Christian alike, joining in what the Vatican described as a universal prayer for peace. To many outside observers, it was a gesture of goodwill, but to those formed in the strict discipline of tradition, it was a sign that the Church had crossed a threshold that should never have been approached. When the Sons of the Most Holy Redeemer, a small but fervently traditional monastic order, saw those images of the pontiff praying alongside pagan figures, something within them broke. The silence they had guarded for years gave way to a declaration that was as solemn as it was defiant. They published an open letter, first quietly, then with growing resonance across Catholic circles, stating that the faith of the saints, the faith of their fathers, is no longer recognizable in the new Church of dialogue and inclusion. They accused the post-conciliar era of producing not renewal but confusion, of replacing divine certainty with pastoral ambiguity, and of setting the Catholic faith on a collision course with itself. Their words were not those of revolutionaries, but of men pleading for fidelity to the gospel they had vowed to serve. And yet their appeal was received not with understanding, but with condemnation. Local bishops distanced themselves publicly, accusing the monks of schism, while the Vatican remained silent, a silence that for many spoke louder than any decree. It was in the early hours of the following morning, while the embers of that interfaith celebration still glowed faintly in the world's headlines, that the monks released a second letter, one that no longer merely expressed concern, but delivered a direct theological challenge to Rome itself. The tone was restrained, yet thunderous, written not as an act of rebellion, but as a plea to the conscience of a church they no longer recognized. In its pages, they declared that what now presents itself as the synodal church has ceased to be the guardian of revealed truth, and has instead become its interpreter and negotiator. We can no longer remain silent, they wrote, when the deposit of faith is treated as a draft open to amendment. Their words spread swiftly through social media, shared by Catholic commentators, scholars, and faithful who had long sensed a growing unease, but had not yet dared to give it voice. It was Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò who then broke his own silence to stand beside them. His message was clear, unyielding, and deeply personal, that the crisis of the Church is not the product of disobedient priests or disoriented faithful, but of a hierarchy that has surrendered divine authority to the politics of the age. Viganò spoke of a false church born of the Second Vatican Council and nourished by the modern obsession with dialogue at all costs, a church that no longer leads souls toward salvation, but toward consensus with the world. His words, written in the austere cadence of a man who once served at the very heart of the Vatican machine, resounded like a verdict from within the walls of conscience itself. To the monks, his support was not merely comforting, it was a confirmation that they were not alone in their anguish. For decades, they had lived by the rhythm of Latin chant and the disciplines of ancient rule, believing that their fidelity would one day be recognized as a quiet testimony to the endurance of truth. Yet now they found themselves labeled as outcasts, punished not for scandal or heresy, but for holding fast to the creed as it had been professed for centuries. The paradox is staggering. in an age that celebrates inclusion, those who remain loyal to tradition are treated as the new exiles. And so, as the debate widens between a church that seeks to please all and one that dares to remain uncompromising, Rome finds itself once again at a crossroads. Beneath the surface calm of official statements, a deeper storm gathers, one of conscience, doctrine, and the question that will define this century of faith: can a church that refuses to claim the whole truth still call itself the Church of Christ? When Pope Leo XIV ascended the pulpit on October 26th, before a congregation gathered for the Jubilee of the Synodal Groups, the air was thick with anticipation. Cameras rolled, pilgrims listened in silence, and for a brief moment it seemed as if the Church might again find a unifying word amid division. But then came a phrase, simple, elegant, and devastating: "No one possesses the whole truth. We must seek it together." To some, it was a poetic call for humility, a recognition of human limitation before divine mystery. Yet to others, to theologians who still read the encyclicals of Pius X and Benedict XVI by candlelight, it was nothing less than a denial of the Church's divine identity, the very claim that she is the Custos Veritatis, the guardian of the truth revealed by Christ himself. Within hours, the homily spread across the Catholic world. Some applauded it as a breath of pastoral renewal, a sign that the Church was shedding its old armor to walk among men again. But in monasteries, seminaries, and the private letters of the faithful, a chill took hold. How could the bride of Christ, who for 2,000 years proclaimed, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," now speak of truth as if it were a shared riddle scattered among competing beliefs? The tension was not merely intellectual, it was existential. For if no one possesses the truth, then no one can be saved by it. The monks of the Most Holy Redeemer, upon hearing these words, recognized in them the culmination of everything they had feared: the slow transformation of revelation into dialogue, of doctrine into suggestion, of the eternal word into a mutable conversation. They wrote again, not to condemn the Pope as a man, but to mourn what they saw as the loss of supernatural certainty within his message. In their cells, far from the noise of Rome, they prayed and fasted, their candles flickering beside handwritten copies of the Fathers, the Councils, and the Creed, those living witnesses that had once made Catholic faith unshakable. Meanwhile, Archbishop Viganò sharpened his tone, declaring that synodality, the very concept at the heart of Pope Leo's pontificate, was a political experiment disguised as spirituality. He called it the democratization of the divine, a phrase that sent shivers through those who understood what he meant: that by making truth a collective search, the Church had ceased to proclaim and had begun to consult. He warned that once obedience to God is replaced by obedience to committees, authority becomes tyranny without grace, a hollow form wielded in the name of inclusion but devoid of divine legitimacy. And so the faithful are left between two visions: one church restless and changing, the other still and eternal. Between these, the soul of Catholicism now trembles, asking itself which voice is truly from God, the one that invites all to dialogue, or the one that guards a truth too sacred to dilute. In the days that followed, the debate no longer belonged to theologians or bishops, it seeped into the hearts of ordinary believers, whispered in confessionals, debated at kitchen tables, and pondered in the quiet of nightly prayer. There was a growing sense that something irreversible had taken place, that a church which once spoke with the voice of heaven now spoke with the vocabulary of the world. For centuries, the Catholic faith had been the anchor of certainty in a restless sea of philosophies, but now that very anchor seemed to have been lifted, leaving the bark of Peter to drift in the winds of modern sentiment. The monks, in their isolation, became a symbol, unwanted by some, revered by others, of what it means to remain faithful when obedience and fidelity no longer point in the same direction. Their rebellion was not loud. There were no marches, no manifestos, shouted from pulpits, only the silence of prayer and the defiance of continuity. They represented a church that remembers, a church that refuses to forget the cost of truth, and around them, a small but growing remnant began to gather: priests, laity, even a few bishops, men and women who saw in their resistance not arrogance, but love, the desperate love of those who cannot watch the bride of Christ be reshaped into something unrecognizable. Archbishop Viganò's words, once dismissed as the warnings of a retired diplomat, now resounded with renewed urgency. He spoke of a false church of human manufacture, a structure clothed in the language of mercy, but emptied of its supernatural purpose. The true church, he wrote, will always be crucified, for she carries the mark of her Lord. When she seeks comfort in applause, she ceases to be his. These were not the words of a man seeking division, but of one who saw in compromise the slow erosion of faith itself. His tone was grave, almost prophetic, that a church which ceases to proclaim Christ as the only way of salvation becomes merely another voice in the marketplace of ideologies. Thus, two visions now stand face to face, irreconcilable and solemn. On one side, the church of tradition, hierarchical, sacrificial, and sure of her divine mission. On the other, the church of dialogue, horizontal, restless, and endlessly revising her own vocabulary to suit the world's ears. Between them lies the same question that has haunted Christianity since its first martyrdoms: shall truth adapt to man, or man to truth? And so Rome, eternal yet trembling, finds itself once again at the edge of decision. The faithful watch as cardinals speak cautiously, bishops hesitate, and the people of God grow weary of contradiction. The sons of the Most Holy Redeemer continue their prayers in exile, their chants echoing through stone corridors, while the world outside moves on. Yet perhaps in that echo lies a warning for all who still believe, that when the Church forgets her cross, she forgets herself. The struggle is not political, nor even institutional. It is spiritual, a clash between the divine church and the human church, between sacrifice and consensus, between the crown of thorns and the crown of popularity. And in that clash, every believer must now choose where to stand. If you believe that truth cannot be rewritten, that faith cannot be negotiated, and that Christ remains the same yesterday, today, and forever, then perhaps you already know your answer. What do you think? If this story moved you, comment Amen below, and may God bless you and keep you steadfast in His truth.